So some time ago, I did a close reading of the rhetoric of Mitch McConnell, describing why the way that he addressed two bills, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is a voting rights bill, and H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is also a voting rights act, obviously, as the title implies. Why the way that he addressed that rhetoric, I didn't specifically use the term, but it embodies what Roland Barthes refers to as a mythology. And the way that it does that is that it disguises itself as a subject positionality that generalizes a universe that doesn't in fact exist. And the way that Mitch McConnell does this is that he allows himself to speak for Americans. He uses the term Americans, and he, in this very brief criticism of these voting rights acts, I think it's specifically focused on H.R. 1, but it doesn't make much difference. The rhetoric is the same. He says, he speaks for all Americans, and he says, Americans don't need. And he fails to address precisely why certain groups of Americans do need protection against laws that remove their rights to speak for themselves, rights to have a voice in their government, rights to elect officials that represent them and not some mythologized, abstracted character of what an American is. Underlying his use of rhetoric and terms and is very similar to what Trump does. Trump takes control of the American flag, right? He pretends that his policies, his racist policies, against African Americans and his silencing of African American ability to protest police violence, he pretends that this is, in fact, some nationalist love of America, and it's for the flag. The flag stands in for this abstract idea of what can't be criticized. So without stepping too far and making the claim that all nationalisms are inherently fascist, which is arguable, but I won't make that claim now. I don't think that it's pushing things at all to recognize the fact that in the United States within the last few years, particularly under Trump, Trump certainly encouraged it, but before that even, and in the growing support for him, that there's been a surge in neo-fascist ideology that includes racism, in all different manners, and anti-immigrationist movements, and all of this sort of euphemistically lumped under populism, whatever that might be, and the more insidious and terrifying aspects of it, framed in more innocuous ways. But largely, this movement, and it's not just in the United States, it's all across the globe, right? It's everywhere. Has been largely successful at this process of mythologizing the subject and taking control of the U.S. flag. Now, what I'm presenting here is just like a quick, Google search of pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian demonstrations in the United States. And one of the things that interests me is that in the pro-Israel demonstrations, you see the American flag a lot. And in the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, you don't. So, clearly the identification with the flag, which I'm arguing is part of this process of mythologizing that I've introduced in other pieces, narrations and discussions and discourses that I've been maintaining. That part of that part of this deployment of the flag is, this mythologization of this universal subjectivity of the American, and it's a white subjectivity, right? It's the one that Mitch McConnell deploys. It's the one that Donald Trump refuses black subjectivities to criticize in his, statements against kneeling in the NFL and other sports organizations, and this nationalism that is fascist, but basically like finds a way of deploying itself. I'm not going to go through all of the images now. Clearly, like other images appear in the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that probably wouldn't appear in the pro-Israel demonstrations, right? Like the Guy Fawkes mask here. Okay, so V doesn't show up, as far as I can tell. These rabbit ears are kind of V, but I don't think they have much to do with that particular character. They don't. This kind of radicality, doesn't really show up in the pro-Israel imagery. Now I'll scan a little bit further and see what else we find. And I didn't really like orchestrate this. I think it's something that I've noticed, and I just assumed that if I did this search that this is what we would find, so that the image would be different. Yeah, and there it is again. And one of the pieces that I've done recently that I haven't talked about is reclamations of the deployment of the American flag. In back in the 60s, like we had a radical movement of reclaiming. Here's one that associates it with, this is obviously in Great Britain, the Union Jack. Okay, now what's interesting about the Union Jack is this is a colonialist flag. All right, I mean, this is like, let's not pretend that it's anything else. This is a colonialist flag. You can pretend that the U.S. flag belongs to ideas of democracy and freedom and certain values, even though it has this history. But the Union Jack is all about like taking control over the world on the part of the British Empire. Anyway, you don't see colonialist flags in the Palestinian protesting camp too much. It's interesting though. And we'll get to why I'm. Here we go. Here's another one. All right. And here's another one. Okay, now this is interesting. All right. I almost don't want to say anything. I'm afraid that saying too much will not allow these particular subjects to speak for themselves. I mean, I'm really moved by this image. I'm really moved by this image. I want it to stand on its own. All right, with that as a kind of backdrop to the conceptual framework of two different types of protest movements going on in the United States right now, and reactions to the kinds of strategies that people use in discussing political positionalities and the functions of protest, and in describing actions of nation states, like in describing America, say, as is America a racist? Are you allowed to say America is racist? And then what forces stop you from saying that? Or are you allowed to say that Israel is committing these atrocities? And what forces stop you from saying that? Or is it wrong to say that? So, I've been addressing these issues, and I've presented some material, but I want to address, in the same way that I did with Mitch McConnell, a statement on the part of Michael Safard. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly. It's S-F-A-R-D, and I'm pronouncing it Safard, and I hope that's correct. But Michael Safard is a prominent Israeli human rights attorney, and he wrote a legal opinion. And I want to read little clips of what he said about this particular word genocide, and whether it applies to the practices and policies of Israel against the Palestinian people. And I want to read the statement and then analyze its rhetoric, and then address it, to the best of my ability. And I'm certainly not an Israeli human rights attorney or a Palestinian human rights attorney, and I don't know much about the history of this term, other than what I've investigated. But I just want to look at it. So he said this, and I'll quote. He said, Israel's policy, quote, doesn't even begin to meet the threshold of what genocide is. Okay, so genocide is, for Michael Safard, clearly well defined. It's got hard edges, and its definition should be fairly precise and clear in what it represents. And then he says, and I think it cheapens the very important and grave concept of genocide. Now, I think what he's referring to there is that the fact that genocide was the idea of genocide, was coined, after the Jewish Holocaust on the part of the Nazis, and even though it has that specific local conceptualization, I mean, you could very easily push a program of Jewish genocide much, much further back in history. And I mean, even the word pogrom wasn't used until, to my knowledge, until the 1890s, early in the 1890s. And certainly pogroms, in one form or another, had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in what meaningful way could these forced displacements of Jewish people not be described as a kind of genocide? I think that, whereas Michael Safard, says that it cheapens the concept of genocide to describe certain, to delineate it in a certain way, I think it cheapens the history of the genocide sides committed against the Jewish people over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, to not recognize a continuity between what was being performed in Russia, what was being performed in Poland, what was being performed in all of these localities, prior to the rise of a certain form of nationalistic fascism in Germany. And certainly it was escalated in Nazi Germany, and certainly like the industrialization, of genocide, and the technology, that was instigated at this, state and national level, was much more sophisticated than our idea of like local communities, in these kind of much less well-defined state structures deploying acts of violence to eliminate the Jewish people from specific locations, and simply because we think of the pogroms as acts of terrorism and violence that don't involve enslavement or don't involve extermination. But deaths occurred, and what are people to do when they're driven to nowhere, when they have nowhere to go, when they have no resources? So I don't think I'm jumping ahead, but I don't think that putting arbitrary restrictions on a term that has a long history, simply because that term in its specificity originated at a certain point, really makes all that much sense. But I'm kind of getting ahead of the argument here. All right, so let me see. Okay, so here is the rest of the statement on the part of Michael Safard that I want to address in the terms that it delineates its specificity, and in the terms that it presents itself as authority over this particular word, genocide. So he states, and this is again a quote: "First and foremost, in order to commit the crime of genocide, one needs," this one is interesting, like it's very remote, needs. It's almost like he's apologizing in advance. Needs, like we don't think of like committing the crime of genocide. You would have a need, I mean, it's a weird construction to me, right? In order to commit the crime of genocide, one needs to have an intention to exterminate. I get that it's just grammatical. Excuse me. But it's weird. One needs to have an intention to exterminate in whole or in part a group, Safard said. And in the 30 years of my activism and more than 20 years of litigation, I haven't seen a shred of evidence that Israel officials and decision makers hold such an intention. All right. Okay. So the first thing that I want to address is whether, in fact, that's an apt or an obvious or a somehow agreed upon definition of genocide, that those who commit such an act need to have an intention to exterminate. And we'll address that by going back to the origins of the word. So the term genocide originates in either 1943 or 1944, depending on what your source you're looking at, and it comes from a formulation made by the Polish lawyer of Jewish descent, Raphael Lemkin, who's also known for his work establishing the Geneva Convention, and it specifically relates to the Jewish Holocaust across Europe on the part of the Nazis. But in formulating the definition, he has already abstracted it to apply to, it doesn't specifically apply to that precise historical period and those events, but across history, he generalizes it as a description that can be used, to discuss, for example, the Armenian genocide. He uses it to discuss, other acts of terrorism and extermination of entire groups of people. So he writes of this term the following, and this is a quote. He's describing here as contextual background why the term doesn't necessarily only signify mass killings. More often, genocide refers to a coordinated plan aimed at destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups so that these groups wither and die like plants that have suffered a blight. The end may be accomplished by the forced disintegration of political and social institutions, of the culture of the people, of their language, their national feelings, and their religion. It may be accomplished by wiping out all basis of personal security, liberty, health, and dignity. When these means fail, the machine gun can always be utilized as a last resort. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the attack on individuals is only secondary to the annihilation of the national group to which they belong. Now, he does use the expression coordinated plan. But he says the coordinated plan is to be aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, so that these groups wither and die like plants that have suffered a blight. If we go back to Michael Safard's statement, and by the way, Michael Safard is responsible for a legal argument, claiming that the state of Israel is in fact, committing crimes of apartheid. So that other word that's being contested, he does not contest, but he does contest the use of the word genocide. But his argument clearly rests upon this very specific notion of intention. So does the state of Israel intend to eliminate a group of people, in this case the Palestinians, in their policies? Now, the definition provided by Raphael Lemkin refers to coordinated plan. Now, coordinated plan would here be standing in for intentionality, right? We don't know what intention is behind, all of the, for example, let's go back to Mitch McConnell and these laws, these voting rights restrictions that are being initiated across the United States right now. None of them say that they're racist, right? The voting changes in the state of Arizona legislature doesn't say that it's specifically designed to interfere with the voting rights of Native American people. The voting rights restrictions in Georgia don't say within their designation that they're specifically designated to interfere with the ability of African Americans to vote in the state of Georgia. They don't say any of that. So we don't know what the intention is. The intention is always masked by the language and the mythology that's presented in the mask, right? The mythological mask that's presented as this national identity. So what these Voting Rights Acts in fact say that their coordinated plan is to ensure, and preserve the integrity of election, right? But in fact, what they are racist, um, uh, racist policies that are specifically designed to ensure that people of color across the United States will have barriers and obstacles placed in their way, and that these obstacles will hamper them, or at least hamper the number of them that actually can vote, and that this this intrusion upon the right to vote will favor the Republican Party. So that's, even though that there's no direct statement of that, I mean, it's not difficult to infer that that's the coordinated plan, right? And that's why we need HR 1, and that's why we need HR 4. And no one's ever going to come out and tell you that, right? They're not going to tell you what their intentions are. Very rarely, maybe in Hitler's Germany, because, and on the part of some of these extreme fascist neo-right organizations like the Proud Boys or Trump's other favorite groups, that there will be an admission of a coordinated plan to eliminate and exterminate. But that rarely happens, especially in the stages in which you have to have support from other nations, and such a coordinated plan is so incredibly offensive that it's unlikely that in the state of global economy that we have now, that any nation would be foolish enough to admit to such an intentionality. But anyway, let's see if other than the idea of intention, if we remove that idea of intention and say that there may be some kind of a mask, right? And the coordinated plan, as coordinated or intentional as it is, isn't willing to reveal itself. If some of the other conditions that distinguish genocide from, say, acts of removal or policies of expulsion, that would fall outside of genocide. If we can distinguish between those kinds of policies and what's here described specifically as relating to the nature of genocide by the individual who coined that term in the early 40s, in relationship to what actions needed to be taken to prevent genocide from occurring again. So it's aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of life of national groups. Well, I mean, I think that, that part of the definition certainly applies to the Palestinians. So that these groups wither and die like plants that suffered at blight. That's a very poetic description, but without fresh water, without food, without resources, without the ability to move on the street, without safety, without the right to relocate, can one survive? The end may be accomplished by the forced disintegration of political and social institutions. Certainly that applies. The culture of the people, certainly that applies. Of their language, and it's more difficult to argue that point, but I don't think all of these, have to necessarily apply. Certainly in the United States, one of the means of genocide was to destroy, people's ability to use their native languages. Native Americans were denied their language African Americans were denied their language. Even in the assimilation process, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, all denied use of their language in schools, but not only in schools, like on ballots, again, initiating difficulties and obstacles in the ability to engage in democracy. Their national feelings and their religions, certainly that's the case. It may be accomplished by wiping out all bases of personal security, liberty, health, and dignity. Certainly that's the case. And then only when these means fail, he argues that machine guns can always be utilized as a last resort. And that is also, being deployed now. So I'm not, other than the coordinated plan. And again, when I address the issue of Israel's support of South Africa, beginning in the 70s and continuing until apartheid South Africa no longer existed, there was never a statement that said, we are performing, support and we are maintaining economic relationships, as a coordinated plan to ensure apartheid in South Africa. Rather, statements were made saying that this is almost in an opportunistic way, right? Backtracking from after the termination of apartheid in South Africa, defenses of Israel had been, that it was a necessary relationship. The economy demanded it because otherwise Israel would not have been able to survive, etc., etc., etc. So there was never like an open acknowledgement that this alliance was an alliance made, that ensured the security of apartheid. So even coming to terms with the idea of Israel as a supporter of apartheid in South Africa and as enacting apartheid, in the nation and state of Israel is a big deal. But the next stage that needs to be addressed is this issue of genocide and what it means, for a people that have such a long history of experiencing genocide to be reenacting it, and is it even possible, like within such a powerfully formed psychology to acknowledge the shadow of this, like the scope of such an oppression, on the part of the oppressed, and it's a powerful issue of our time and relates in a lot of ways to what's going on in the United States, and in our reckoning with the history of injustice here, and how we're going to come to terms with that history. Can you look at that? Can you look at the shadow and not turn away? Particularly if it's your shadow, and it's almost impossible to see, to look at, to see. So Mark Ruffalo has retracted his use of the term genocide to refer to the policies of violence and economic extinction that Israel is placing on the Palestinian people, and has been, for a number of years. And whatever side of that argument that one falls on, whether the term you regard the term as being intolerably offensive when applied to the state of Israel, or accurate in terms of their policies, this issue does exist, especially as we look at the escalation of violence against Jews in the United States. And we live in inflammatory times, so it becomes easier and easier when you have a long period of hatred being spread by these, reactionary groups, people like the Proud Boys, and that, to Ruffalo's credit, that he's concerned about this. But the fact that he's concerned about it suggests that his statements aren't anti-Semitic. I mean, to me, it demonstrates that's the kind of ethical thinking that demonstrates that he can distinguish between the state of Israel and its policies and what it means to be Jewish, and whether that's Jewish in Israel or Jewish in America. And that's, seems to me, what we need to do. So as part of his deployment of, disavowing this statement on genocide, whether, he believes that Israel's policies are genocidal or not, he recognizes what I've been trying to point to, the psychological difficulty that subjects that have experienced this long history and understand where the origin of this word come from have in looking at it in the mirror. He understands that. He understands this formation of justification to turn away. And so as part of the deployment of his disavowal, he had posted another Twitter statement from someone who I'm not familiar with. I think is also an actor, Josh Gad. Fans of Josh Gad will know who he is. I don't have television, but he wrote, "It never stops breaking my heart how easily anti-Semitism comes to so many." And then I understand that as a sentiment, but it comes easier when we've had years of accepting it on the part of the American government. And that's what we've had. But when the Proud Boys marched and when they shouted these slogans that weren't condemned by the President of the United States, I mean, how could anyone have thought that there wouldn't be consequences? How could anyone have imagined that if we failed to condemn these white nationalists at that level of our institutions, that we wouldn't have this kind of violence? And how could it be that in Israel they supported such a president that didn't condemn these white nationalists in the United States, and then for whatever reason admired and supported his ideas of a wall and his authoritarian approach to politics in the United States? How could we not see that these outcomes would manifest themselves in the United States? And he writes again, "It never stops breaking my heart how easily anti-Semitism comes to so many, and how difficult it seemingly is for people to speak out against it." Given examples of Trump or Mitch McConnell or whoever failed to protect the American people from these ideas, even though it was their job. I will stand up against bigotry of all kind from Islamophobia to racism. And I don't know Josh Gad, but I hope that he supported Black Lives Matter. I hope that he's out there marching for the rights of Palestinians. So to end this discussion here, I'll just briefly return to a different discussion that I had begun in describing some of the work that I had done in the 1980s, and then following from there, that involved issues of forced displacement in a number of different social contexts, and those social displacements, those forced movements applied to individuals who were homeless and seen by ideologies of San Diego culture in the 1980s as being, unwanted and a problem to the economy, unsightly, health hazard. So wanted to remove, these individuals from sight and from mind through, policies of gentrification and improvement that I saw as, if not exactly a kind of ethnic cleansing, certainly a related kind of psychological analogy. And from that, to issues of anti-immigrant sentiment, and but even within radical movements, the eruption of moments of racism, as I recalled in one piece, the Cesar Chavez's National Farm Workers Movement erupted with anti-Semitic sentiment against one of the organizers, and I try to address these issues of not being able to see the bigger picture. Why is it that we can so easily identify with our own oppression and fail to see how we're manipulated by broader ideological apparatuses or apparati that draw us in, to these sort of tribal displays of violence, and this is what we want to struggle against, So, how do I criticize the state of Israel, but define very clearly that my relationship to prejudices of all kinds, is one in which I'm willing to participate and struggle against. Yes, we support and want to protect all of the American Jews that are under attack at this time, and we defy anti-Semitism. We need to clearly stand our ground insofar as a criticism of any authoritarian, racist policies are concerned, no matter where they come from and no matter how difficult it is to raise those issues. So this is really what this video is trying to discuss, and the previous one as well. And not so much to defend Ruffalo or anyone else, but to raise these issues as a way of coming to terms with our understanding of how the struggle against fascism is multi-layered and exists in a lot of different forms, including what goes on inside of our own minds, what histories we've had, what our understanding is of these histories,
and how they relate to like the macro and micro dynamics of politics, both inside the United States and its history, and globally, across other manifestations of social justice and the absence of social justice over time. So it's really an opening up of, I guess, that discussion more than it is an attempt to justify any singular position.